So my name is Arosha Bandara, and I'm a senior lecturer in computing at the Open University in the United Kingdom. So I was invited to do this session for the Sustainable Education Foundation by Akshika Vijayasundara. And so it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to people interested in computing research in Sri Lanka and perhaps hopefully give them some guidance, all of you listening, some guidance on how to progress your interest through a research career, the first step of which is to do a PhD. So let me start by giving some background about myself and where I come from. Um, so as I mentioned, I'm a senior lecturer in computing, and my journey to get here started in Sri Lanka, where I was a high school student at Dharmaraja College in Kandy, and then in the 1990s I moved to the UK, where I did my first degree, an M.Eng Honours in Information Systems Engineering at Imperial College London, and then I went off and started working in industry for a few years. So I worked for a company called Sapient, who are still around. They're now called Sapient Nitro, and they were a systems integration company doing software consultancy work. And I worked for them for a few years in the United States and in India before coming back to Imperial College to do my PhD. And my PhD title is a formal framework for policy analysis and refinement. And I'll get into this a little bit as we go through and explain what my PhD was about and what my current research is about as well. So as you can see on the slide, I then, after finishing my PhD, I joined the Open University in 2006 as a lecturer, and now I'm a senior lecturer. So you can see some information about my website and my Twitter handle. I'm generally fairly active on Twitter, and my website is a blog which I update periodically, not every week I'm afraid, but as often as I can. And actually the slides from this presentation will be posted on the website as well as a slide share. So you can refer to anything you see in these slides over there. So I'm actually switched into my presentation view, so I can't see the Facebook Live session at the moment. So I'm just going to switch back into the Facebook Live to check that folks can hear me. So maybe a few, I don't know, likes or comments just to make sure that everything's coming through clearly before I carry on. So I can see that there are 8 of you online, or 9 of you, and I'm assuming that you're hearing me clearly, given that there are no comments indicating that's not the case, and I can see a like as well, so that's great. Okay, so let me carry on with this talk. So I work in a part of the Open University called the Center for Research in Computing, and this spans a couple of departments in the university, the School of Computing and Communications, which is where I'm based, and another institute called the Knowledge Media Institute. And the research that we do covers a number of different areas which are shown on this slide. So this is a very high-level categorization of the research we do. So human-centered computing, this is where we study how people interact with computers and how computer systems can be better designed for the people that use them. We also have an area of research known as language, multimedia, and knowledge technologies. And in this domain, what people are looking at are things like computational linguistics, how to do information retrieval, particularly for multimedia technologies, and also some aspects of computer generation of language, and so on. And finally, there's an area, software engineering and design, which is where I sit. And this is a group of researchers who are interested in a variety of different aspects of software engineering and how to design systems. So if I go into that in a little more detail, here's a picture that represents the work we do in software engineering, which we broadly call secure, adaptive, usable software engineering. And the reason for this comes from the different areas of research that we do in software engineering. So if you can see along the bottom here, there are a number of pillars that we build our research on. So that comes from automated software engineering on the left-hand side. And automated software engineering is all about tools and techniques for making the software engineering process more automatic. And this might be techniques for program analysis or automatically detecting meaningful changes in source code, or trying to generate traceability links between requirements and code objects and so on. If we move along to the next pillar, this is called empirical studies of software development. And this is where we really study the development process and the people who are doing software development activities to understand what motivates them, what kind of tools they use, how they engage with different processes. And so this is a bit of an unusual area of software engineering research, I guess, for typical computing schools, because it has a human dimension to it. And you'll see this as a returning theme in the research that I'm interested in. And that human dimension is looking at the people who develop software. There's another aspect of the empirical studies of software development where we actually use quantitative techniques to study code repositories to understand what happens when people commit code into repositories and how many bugs they might introduce, or the impact of quality by looking for copies, clones of code, and things like that. And those also come under empirical studies of software development, because we're really using data and analyzing it using qualitative and quantitative methods to understand what's happening in the software development process. The third pillar is engineering adaptive software systems. And this really is my core area of research. So I'll get into this a little more later, but it's about understanding how software-intensive systems that have software as a core component, can be engineered to adapt to their operating environment. So moving along, we have another specialism in requirements engineering. So this is about understanding the needs of stakeholders and figuring out how to best meet them through the software products that are developed. And we also have some colleagues, some collaborators we work with in the area of social psychology. So this is the psychology of groups and how people work together in communities, what drives antisocial behaviors versus pro-social behaviors, and so on. And so this group they're not software engineers, the people who we collaborate with, they're actually psychologists. But we find that because of software being so integrated into human life nowadays, understanding the psychology of the software engineering process and also the psychology of people who use software is a useful input into how we engineer software effectively, which is also related to the final pillar, which is user experience design. And this is where we overlap a little bit with the human-centered computing researchers in our school, but really understanding how we can engineer the user experience into the software that's developed. So building on these pillars, we have a platform for research which applies the research in a number of different application domains, and you can see these in the green boxes. So we have aviation, healthcare, sustainability, policing, and cutting across all of these different areas, we also look at how to engineer security, privacy, and digital forensics into the software that's developed for these different domains. And then we use the application domains and our research areas to build a technical and empirical infrastructure, build examples that illustrate our work, and explore new ideas through pilot projects. And of course, this is supported by the people who we work with and the different policies we bring to the software engineering research process. So for example, one of the key things we're interested in is to make sure that we think about the ethical implications of the software engineering research that we do. And this is called responsible research and innovation, and it's a very up-and-coming and important topic in the area of research, not just in software engineering, but more broadly. So we've really taken this on board, and because most of our software engineering research has this human-centered aspect to it, we are very keen to make sure that we do the research in a responsible and ethically sound way. So the policy aspect is also an important part of the research we do. So as I mentioned, my own research is about engineering adaptive software systems. I'm interested in understanding how to model and reason about system behavior in a way that allows us to change the behavior of the software at runtime to meet particular requirements. And I've been applying these techniques in a number of different areas. So in my PhD, I was very much looking at network performance and security issues, where I was interested in how we could use this idea of policy-based management techniques to change the configuration of a network infrastructure to meet the performance and security requirements of the administrators of the network. Since then, I've expanded this thread of work to look at other aspects of software engineering and adaptive systems. So privacy in mobile applications and social media, for example, where I'm interested in looking at ways of using sensor data that mobile applications might have access to, and actually having a system try to learn privacy rules that would govern how information is shared and guide people to make more privacy-aware sharing decisions. I've also been looking at security for cloud computing applications and adaptive usability for enterprise applications. So the adaptive usability work is quite interesting because it actually tries to come up with a model-driven approach where we have models of the user interfaces and the tasks that people are trying to achieve, and then at runtime we will actually modify the user interface depending on the context or qualities of the user. So if we, for example, you could have a mobile application that is a context database, and if the system detects that you are running or moving very quickly, it will adapt the user interface to make all the buttons larger and easier to press while you're running, for example. And the most recent area of research where I'm trying to apply my techniques for engineering adaptive software systems is in smart homes for healthcare. And so this is a project that we're just getting started, where we're trying to develop a patient-centric technical infrastructure that allows all the various people who are involved in the care of a patient to work together with a technology infrastructure that provides a personalized resilience care experience that it creates a collaboration between the technology and the people who are involved. And there are lots of different elements to this where we're trying to model the user interfaces, the care information, privacy requirements or privacy arguments as we call them, and we're trying to build an adaptive infrastructure that will enable these information exchanges to happen in a way that maintains the care but also maintains the privacy of the different people involved. So that's a kind of very quick potted history and overview of some of my research interests, and now I'm again going to switch back the view to the live stream so I can just make sure that there aren't any pending questions about what I've been talking about while I get there. So let me just have a quick scroll through the comments here. I can see a number of different questions. Okay. All right, so I think the questions are very much focused on the PhD application aspect. If you do have questions about my research, I'd be happy to pick that up at some point as well. But let me move on to the next part of the presentation so that you can get an idea of what the PhD process is like and how to go about applying. And yeah, thanks for the questions, Jeannie KP and Oshan. So I have noted them, and hopefully the presentation will answer them. And if I don't, I'll come back to them at the end in the Q&A session. Okay. So let's start with a very broad question about what exactly is a PhD, because before applying for one, it's probably very important to understand what exactly the end product of a PhD is. So I'm going to use some very neat illustrations that were produced by a colleague, Professor Matt Might, out in the United States, and he produced this blog post called The Illustrated Guide to a PhD. And so the starting point is to think about, okay, let's imagine that this circle represents all human knowledge, everything that anyone does actually know, sorry, not possibly know, but does actually know. So this is all known knowledge to date. And if we think about our journey from when we're born and through schooling, when we start out, we have a primary education which kind of covers the core things that are part of human knowledge. This might be about language and mathematics and a bit of science. And a key feature of this is that it's quite broad. It covers all different domains. So you might learn some geography and some history, all at a very basic level. And then as we move through secondary school, it's still very general, but a bit more advanced. So we get closer to the edge of human knowledge, but not by much, and it's still very, very broad and balanced across all the different domains. So the next stage might be that we go on to do a bachelor's degree. And now we still have a breadth. Bachelor's degrees do cover a broad range of subjects, but there's some specialism aspect to it as well. So if you did a bachelor's degree in computing, you clearly would have specialized in a number of different computing subjects, but you would have done other optional modules, and certainly depending on your context, if you went to a tertiary education system like in the United States, where you do lots of options before you pick your major, you would have had this broad education and then picked a specialism for your major. But it would still be only a limited delve into that specialism. So if you're really interested in that specialism, what you might do next is to go and do a master's degree. And now you go much deeper and try to get closer to the edge of human knowledge and gain a lot of skills and understanding about a particular discipline area, let's say computing for the sake of argument, and you push that forward quite a fair degree. And as part of that master's degree, you might start reading some research papers. But it's really when you start doing a PhD that you read research papers in a much greater depth and with much greater intensity until you feel that you have actually reached the edge of human knowledge in your particular area. And so there are two features of what's happening here. One is that you're getting deeper and deeper into human knowledge, getting closer and closer to the edge. But also, in order to do that, the only way to do that in a tractable way is also to specialize more and more. So you will end up focusing greatly until you get to a point where you're focusing on a very, very small domain of research, but you know everything there is to know about it in terms of what other people have done before you in that area. And so if we now zoom in and we're at the edge of human knowledge, and what you end up doing in your PhD is to try and understand a problem that has not yet been solved and can't be solved using the techniques or knowledge that we have at the edge of knowledge, at this cutting edge. So this is what, when people talk about the cutting edge or the bleeding edge of knowledge, this is where we're at. And what you're trying to do with your PhD is to push that boundary of human knowledge just a tiny bit forward. And so that you have discovered something that nobody else knew before you did your research. And you are able to demonstrate that A, that has some validity, it has some relevance, it solves an interesting problem, and B, the way you've solved it is scientifically rigorous, that if somebody else repeats your process, they will end up with the same results as you. And so that's really what the PhD is about. It's about pushing the bounds of human knowledge forward, which is incredibly exciting. And that's one of the real things about research is, of course, that innate curiosity to investigate and study, and that drive to make that contribution to human knowledge, and be a real expert in your field of study. Of course, that's also its challenge, and that's why the process of doing a PhD, is not one to just be taken lightly. You are setting yourself up for quite a deep challenge, quite a significant challenge of understanding the literature that has been written in your field of study, and advancing the limits of human knowledge. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be this massive contribution to human knowledge. Even the smallest contribution is a valid one as far as a PhD is concerned. And of course, you have all the work that came before you as your starting point. So famously, I think it was Isaac Newton who said, whatever I've achieved, it has been by standing on the shoulders of giants. And that's what we all do in research. We benefit from the researchers and experts who come before us and publish their work, and we try and validate their work, and then use that to solve the problems that we foresee as being important problems for the future, by building on that work and pushing the boundary a bit further forward. So hopefully that gives you a better idea of what a PhD is about and what it is that you are thinking about undertaking here. So a few things to know before you start on this process. Some of the prerequisites. So I, of course, know best about the UK system, and I know a little bit about the US system, but it's important to understand what the prerequisites are before you start the application process or start going down this path. So in the UK, you'll find most PhD programs would have expected you to have done a master's program before you start. But there are exceptions. So for example, the Open University is part of our mission to be open to people, irrespective of their educational background. But recognizing that a PhD is a significant undertaking, we still have some minimum criteria, which is to have an upper second bachelor's degree. But even then, there are exceptions to that as well. So if a potential student can demonstrate that they have a good understanding of what research involves, either by working in research labs as interns and maybe publishing some papers, these things can mitigate for the lack of an upper second bachelor's degree at the OU. In the US, there's an expectation that you would have a bachelor's degree, you would have done the GRE exams and achieved the required score by your institution, and of course you'd have the language requirements as well. And of course, the language requirements apply to the UK as well. So any UK institution will expect you to have achieved a high score on the IELTS exam. Now I'm trying to remember the exact level you have to achieve. I think it's at least 6.5 across all the different areas, if I remember correctly, and maybe a 7 overall. So it's this expectation, but don't hold me to that. When you look at the application process, make sure that you check into those things in more detail. The duration, so another thing to be aware of. So in the UK, it usually is 3 to 4 years. Normally if you are funded on a PhD program, the funding is only initially guaranteed for 3 years. But so the reason it's a shorter program than other places is that there's no expectation of doing any qualifying courses. So if you already have an MSc, or even if you don't and you've been accepted, you wouldn't be required to do any classes. You'd immediately start doing your research. But the initial enrollment is for a Master of Philosophy degree. So it's not the PhD. And then after a certain period, usually 1 year, you're expected to produce a research report that documents the research you've done so far, what your proposed pathway to completion is. So what is the research problem? What is that contribution to knowledge that you're trying to deliver? And how will you go about it? So by providing that report at the end of the first year, that's assessed, and if it's considered adequate for completing a PhD, you'll be allowed to enroll, or you'll be enrolled automatically to the next stage, which is the PhD candidate stage. In the USA, it's typically 5 to 6 years to complete a PhD, but all programs will have a set of qualifying courses. So these are the basic graduate level courses that you will have to do and pass before you can progress on to the research part of your studies. The topic, so this is very important. So as we saw in the previous slides, the topic of research becomes very, very focused. And as you progress with your studies, in order to do a PhD, you start you go from knowing um, quite a lot of breadth. So you don't know depth, but you know a broad area like computing, for example. But now you have to become more and more focused. And so in the process of that focus, you have to be sure that the angle of attack you take is one that matches your interests. It's something that you really feel enthusiastic about and would like to pursue into the future. And one way to do that is to really do your homework by reading research papers in that area and see how engaging do you find it. Do you find the topic interesting enough for you to read the papers that are relevant to that particular area? And nowadays, thanks to open access publishing and services like Archive and Google Scholar, it's much easier to find lots of research papers before you actually formally apply, and to get an understanding of which topic may be the right topic for you. And finally, of course, the all-important question of funding, and doing some research online to find out what are the different sources of funding. Um, so in the UK context, many universities have their own scholarship programs and will fund students to study with them. Um, there are also other programs like the Commonwealth Scholars Program, um, which you can apply to. And I mean, all of these approaches are quite competitive. You can imagine there are lots of people applying for these things. But of course, if you don't apply, you don't even have a chance. So, it's worth looking into the different funding options that are available, and figuring out which one might be appropriate for you. And there are ways to get more help with that if you, as I'll talk about in the next slide, when you start talking to a potential supervisor, they might be able to guide you into particular funding programs they have available, because they have a project funded in a particular area, so they may have some additional funding to support a studentship. So these are things worth knowing. So hopefully that addresses to some extent the questions around prior requirements and the expectations of an admissions panel. But let me go a little bit more into that, first by covering what you need to do as you prepare your application. So the key thing that admissions panels will be looking at are your CV, so the record of your studies and any work experience that you have, but also your proposal. So all programs will expect you to put together a research proposal. And you should do this by reading the relevant papers to figure out what area you're really interested in. And through that, try to identify an unsolved problem that you might like to work on. Now, the order in which these two things happen vary for different people. So some people identify problems because they're in a work environment or have experienced something through their studies that suggests that, oh, that's a really interesting problem. I wonder if there's a solution to it. So it may be that you've been working on a particular area of software and you've realized that the problem of localizing bugs is quite challenging. So finding out where in the code you need to look in order to solve a particular bug is a challenging problem that comes up again and again. And if you start reading research papers on this, you'll find people have suggested various solutions. And if you look at those solutions, you might find reasons why they still don't work for your particular type of bug localization problem. It might be that you're trying to find bugs to do with security issues, and these are not that well studied in the literature. So you need to do that process of kind of understanding the literature and thinking about potential problems to come up with an idea of what type of PhD you'd like to pursue. And once you have that, you can start writing a proposal that should cover these 4 areas that I've highlighted. You should provide some background about the problem that you'd like to work on, how you understand the literature, the things you've read so far, what do you see as the things you could build on versus the things that don't meet the requirements, and so on. You need to capture what the ultimate aim of your research is. What is the problem you're trying to solve? And how might you go about studying your approach to solving that problem? And finally, there's an expectation you'll be able to say something about how the world will change if you're successful in your research. who would benefit from your research and in what ways. So if we're talking about this bug localization example, it might be the people who will benefit are software developers and the software engineering industry, because the cost of maintaining software will be reduced as a result of your solution. If we're talking about my area, about adaptive systems, the problem might be to do with, how do you learn rules about dynamic behaviors that involve continuous variables that don't change in predictable ways, and what are the machine learning techniques that might allow you to learn the right model to support that adaptive behavior, and so on. So there's a combination of reading research literature and thinking quite hard about what the potential problem you'd like to solve is. Of course, there are shortcuts to this process as well, which you might be quite interested in. So one of the shortcuts is to just find research projects, funded research projects that are advertising they might be directly advertising for PhD places, or they might be advertising for postdoctoral researchers, but that's a way to find the project. And those projects might highlight some key problems that they're trying to solve. And if those problems interest you, if you find that you will be keen to be involved in solving those problems, then you can start reading some of the related research literature and try to put together a proposal that meets those the requirements that research project is looking at. And that's a way then to approach that research team and say, look, I have an interest in a PhD in this area, and would you be interested in helping me find the funding and taking me on as a PhD student? Which comes to my point of where should I apply? And that really comes down to contacting the academics who are studying the area that you are interested in. The way to find these academics is either through the research papers. So as you read research papers, you might find particular academics come up often, and the types of work they're doing is really interesting to you. So you might reach out to them to know if they have ways of funding PhD students, or you might find them through projects, as I said. So by looking at project websites or jobs websites in academia, like jobs.ac.uk, you will find projects that are just about starting and will have some way of explaining the problem that they're trying to solve, and you can use that as your starting point to try and put a PhD application together. So let me switch back to the Facebook Live window. I've been talking for a while, and see what other questions have been coming on. Okay. So yeah. So Chintaka has asked a question: do we need to have publications in a related field? No, it's not necessary to have publications as part of your application at the application stage. Although if you've done an MSc, for example, and you've been successful in publishing something, that will make you stand out from other candidates. So it's always worth, as part of even a bachelor's degree program, if you've done some project work that's interesting, to talk to your supervisors, basically, the academics you're working with, and explore, can I do something that's really worth publishing somewhere? Because that's something to add to your CV and will make you stand out from other candidates who might be applying for PhD positions. But it's not a requirement, Chintaka, it's just a way to stand out. There's also a question about research on smart homes and ideas about collaborating with tech giants such as Microsoft, Google, or even MIT Media Lab. So yes, we do have contacts and collaborations with people like Microsoft Research, Google. I don't have a link personally, but colleagues in my school do. MIT Media Lab, well, they would be the competition for the research that we do. But yeah, I mean, we do explore potential collaborations wherever they arise. And certainly, even if we don't have direct collaborations, we would be looking at the research that these groups do and try to make sure that we're not just repeating their research and replicating it unnecessarily, but we may be trying to validate their research by repeating it. And then we try to build on it and address some of the limitations. And that may be an avenue to start a collaboration. Okay, there's a question about Bitcoin, which I'm going to pick up at the end because that's a bit off topic. Okay, why do I think user interfaces should be adaptive? So the reason for user interfaces to be adaptive, in my opinion, is because um, of the way that computing technology is embedded into our daily lives, mean that it's very hard for a designer to know all the possible contexts in which the technology might be used. And so if you're not sure how and where and when your user will engage with your technology, the whatever assumptions you've made about the usability, the user experience, might not be valid. And an adaptive user interface is an attempt to try and address that and mitigate the usability problems that might come up. Um, so, for example, if you've made an assumption about a user being able to key in a value, so they key in how heavy they are, for example, if they're trying to do measure their health or keep track of their health. Um, but they may be elderly and frail and unable to do that. And in that context, the interface should adapt and accept voice input, for example. So there are reasons why adaptation in user interfaces is important. Um, and whether we can achieve adaptive interfaces for mobile applications with the existing technology, um, somewhat. Some adaptation is possible, but not all adaptations are possible. So, for example, gesture interfaces and haptics are not necessarily something that current technology supports that well. So there's a question about how is life after the PhD? What are the opportunities you would have research-wise and job-wise, which is a very good question. So that's an important thing to understand before starting a PhD, of course, is what your goal is in terms of doing a PhD. So for myself, I've always had an ambition and a desire to teach, and I was keen to try and teach at the leading edge of knowledge. So a PhD was a way to become a university academic and a teacher. And along the way, I found the research to be very interesting and exciting, and that's kind of gone hand in hand. So I try to bring together both teaching and research, and help my students in a university setting. But this is, of course, just one aspect of what happens to people who complete a PhD. And academia isn't the only path that you might consider. If you look at many both technology giants and tech startups, they hire a lot of PhDs. I mean, tech startups often are started by PhD students and their supervisors maybe, or even just the students on their own, based on some ideas that they developed during their research or following on from their research. So there are, I think, lots of different possibilities of using a PhD to further your career, further your aspirations, but you need to figure out what it is you're trying to achieve. Because I think if a PhD for you is a way of delaying that decision for 3 years, it's probably not the right thing to do. So if you're doing a PhD with a purpose, either to become an academic and succeed in academia, or to develop new and interesting technologies that could be commercialized and exploited. So if you have that purpose, that will be much better, and it will keep you driven through the process of your studies. Because I can never say this often enough, and you should never underestimate, staying focused on one particular problem for 3 years is non-trivial. So you need to have intrinsic drivers that keep you engaged, that keep you wanting to wake up every morning and go to the lab and do the reading or do the experimentation work that is expected for you to successfully do the PhD. And really, a lot of the success in PhDs is not about having these amazing flashes of insight, when you're, on the bus or just sitting in a corner contemplating about things. The thing that happens with PhDs, I mean, the value that's added is through developing a set of competencies about analyzing research literature and being able to critique it and understand the limitations of it, competencies around basic skills, and in computing, that's about, software skills. Can you code? Can you understand the basic, or understand how to take apart a third-party library and use it in your own systems. All these basic competencies give you the tool set needed to then say, I have an interesting question about how can I make a user interface adaptive? And now you have the skills to both look at the research literature and also unpick existing solutions and build your own new and novel solution. And then there are other competencies around running experiments, designing experiments and running them and analyzing the data. And so really having the drive to build these competencies, build these basic research skills and apply them over and over again, most of the time you'll be unsuccessful in that when you try to apply them, the answer you get will be a negative answer. It won't be that exciting. But then the more you do it, you will come up with the right experiment that justifies or validates your hypothesis, and it's an exciting result. So that's something to keep in mind. So that 3-year process of keeping yourself driven through this is very important, and therefore the problem you select is also very important. So yeah, don't underestimate that. So let me go to my next slide, which I think captures some of these issues a bit more, and maybe is the actual thing that most people want answers to. So what PhD admissions panels look for? So one of the things is clearly academic skills, and this kind of comes to these basic competencies. Evidence that you have some of the basic skills for your topic. And in computing, that will be about, can you write code? Can you program? Do you have examples of developing systems that involve lots of different complex libraries? If you're interested in pursuing a PhD in machine learning, have you really used a machine learning toolkit like Weka or something else? Or if you're interested in natural language processing, have you used tools like NLTM, the natural language toolkits? Do you understand some of the complications of doing those? So evidence that you have these basic skills that are relevant to your topic is the key thing there. Motivation. So I'm repeating myself here, but they're looking for some way in which you can demonstrate how and why you'd spend 3 years studying this. What would drive you? And there are many things that people, there may be personal drivers that come up based on wanting to solve a problem that's very directly affecting you and your life or a family member, and using that as a way to improve life for other people by addressing this particular research challenge. It may be that you want to become the next Elon Musk. You want to develop the next cutting edge technology, and you have some track record of having kind of innovated at some level. So you can kind of say that goal will keep me motivated to study for 3 years. It doesn't have to be that grand. I mean, anything that you can show how you stick at a challenge, don't give up, and you focus and drive yourself through is a good way to demonstrate motivation. And so you need to get that across. You may be able to get some of that across in your actual written application, but definitely you have to get it across when you're interviewed by the panel. The third thing is about ability to write a thesis. So a PhD thesis in computing is a substantive document usually. It's 80 to 100 pages at least, maybe bigger. I mean, there are some theses that go over multiple volumes depending on the topic. So the panel will want to know that you are capable of writing a big document, not just a 1,000-word essay, but a 15,000-word report, for example. And it's useful to be able to share your project reports from your master's or bachelor's project as part of your application. So you might put that on a website and share the link so that a potential panel member can have a look at your writing and how you structure a report and demonstrate that capability. Communication skills. I mean, this comes across in the proposal about how you write as well, but also in the interview. So can you explain and argue your case? can you use the literature that you've read to defend why the problem you've selected is an important problem? And they're not expecting a completely polished performance here, but it's just the potential that you have the basic skills to explain yourself clearly, and obviously this would be in English, so because that's the kind of lingua franca of science, and therefore is all publishing. Prior research experience. So as I mentioned in my earlier answer, this is not a must-have, but it's something that can help you stand out from the crowd. So, having published papers, and these don't have to be papers you've published completely on your own, but papers you might have co-authored with people, as long as you can explain what your contribution to that research was and how you contributed to doing the research and writing the paper, that will help you stand out from a group of people, some of whom will not have research papers. Internship work is also useful. So if you've been a summer intern in a research group, or as part of your summer internship work, you wrote a report, or produced a publication of some kind, that would be useful to highlight and to demonstrate that you can undertake project work of that kind. And finally, it's about the choice of topic and institution. So the question that a panel will have in their mind is, why does this individual want to do this PhD at our university? So you need to have done some research into the university and the research group you're part of or planning to be part of, to be able to argue why they are the best choice for doing this PhD. And that might be because actually most of the prior publications that you've read that have been working in this area have come from that group, and that you are confident that they will be well placed to support you in progressing that work. Or it may be that the university has a very good international reputation in that particular discipline area. It may be linked to a project. So you need to have an argument about that. And ultimately, so they're also looking at the proposal. So can you write a good proposal that demonstrates an understanding of your domain of study? And ultimately, what all of this comes down to is a judgment of, can this individual who's applying to us, do they have the potential for academic excellence? Can they do research and communicate it effectively to a high standard? One of the benchmarks criteria for awarding a PhD, examiners are asked to assess, is it a contribution to knowledge? Is it the student's own work? And is there publishable material in the PhD? And so this academic excellence aspect comes down to, is this a person who could produce something that could be published in an international conference or journal? And so these are the 7 things that I would highlight as key things that a panel would be looking for. They don't all have to be equally strong, but you want to have some mix of these things in your application to have a chance of success, and certainly if you want to stand out from the crowd. So the particular balance of which things you put emphasize more will depend on your personal background, experience, and results, and so on. So let me switch back to the question view. It's a very good question about how do you maintain mental and physical health during a PhD, given the demanding nature of the work. So there are a few things. I mean, I think the mental health aspect is very important, and is something that may be underplayed or not well noticed in lots of research institutions. But the way that I think we manage mentally in any setting, whether it's work or in a study setting like a PhD, is to have a good support network. And this is about making connections to your fellow PhD students, so you won't be alone in a research group. So to kind of create a network, a self-supporting network who you can chat to, relax with, socialize with, and get some moral support from as you go through the PhD. In addition to your supervisors, most universities will appoint another academic who is a mentor, someone who you can go with and talk to with absolutely no reflection on the success of your PhD. I mean, good supervisors. I would argue, you can talk to your supervisor about any issues as well, and certainly my students would come to me and tell me if they're having difficulties anyway. But the um, the mentor is an additional person. If for whatever reason you feel uncomfortable talking to your supervisor, you could go to the mentor and ask for some help and guidance about how to deal with a particular challenge or some struggle that you're facing. At the Open University in Computing, we have weekly PhD forums. So the PhD students get together and we'll discuss a particular topic relevant to doing a PhD. It might be about writing up, or might be about how to read research literature or research methods. And this is another opportunity to network and get support and be mutually supportive of each other. The physical health side aspect, I mean, of course, if you wherever you go to study, there'll be access to medical care for any kind of physical ailments as well as mental ailments, actually. But also, having a habit and practice of keeping physically active and fit is helpful. So, having a regime of whether, however you get your exercise, whether it's playing sports or going to the gym or just cycling or running, coming up with a routine that allows you to do those things regularly, whether it's daily or a few times a week. Those are all important things, and I think that goes for any kind of job, which can be stressful and demanding, and it's just about managing that work-life balance appropriately. Tarinder, don't worry. Yes, the slides will be made available later, so you'll have access to them. Yes, and yeah, Nandala as well. So yeah, don't worry, the slides will be made available. There's a question, bit off topic. What are your predictions for the future in cybersecurity? Well, at the moment, it seems like cybersecurity is in the news every week for one reason or the other. And I think for the time being, certainly for the next 5, maybe even to 10 years, it'll be an area of intense scrutiny and activity. Researchers have been working in cybersecurity for a while, but actually their solutions have not had the same level of application because the problem hasn't been so acute. But as more and more of our lives become technologically driven, Internet of Things, social media, all of these technological interfaces to our lives, so that the world is not just about the physical world and the computing world being separate, but you'll have this integration between the cyber, physical, and social worlds in which we interact. And so keeping that integrated world secure will be an increasing challenge. So I think cybersecurity will be a very interesting and active topic for the future. And areas like the Internet of Things and the integration between online and offline systems and the challenges that raises will be hot topics for research. So, okay, so there's a question about part-time work for PhD students and what are the restrictions that they have. So there isn't. So there are restrictions in immigration law about how much part-time work you can do as essentially a full-time student. I don't know what the current rules are in the UK. I think it's about 20 hours a week, if I remember correctly. But many students do work on campus in different capacities. Usually in a not at the Open University, but in a traditional university that has students on campus, undergraduate students on campus. Most PhD students will be teaching assistants, and they will get paid separately for being a teaching assistant. And this gives useful experience of being an educator in an academic setting. So that's something that's quite actually useful experience. At the Open University, there are similar opportunities to teach in online courses, to moderate forums and do some online teaching, but it's not required. Like in a face-to-face institution, you will be expected to teach, to be a teaching assistant for some courses, but at the OU, that's not the case. Who is your okay? So will teaching be compulsory? So I think Oshan, I answered that question now. And who is your ideal PhD student? Tricky question. Um, so for myself, I think really it's about that potential to excel and having an intrinsic drive and interest in the research. So the best students that I've had are the students who are self-managing, and actually beyond self-managing, they manage me. They will push me to read what they've written, or make sure that I'm reading the papers that they're reading and can give them feedback, and so on. So supervision happens in a team normally, so it's not a single supervisor. And so there's a process of basically building up a relationship with a group of academics and working with them. But yeah, so the best students are ones that don't see their supervisors as somehow the font of all knowledge. I mean, supervisors know quite a lot and they can guide you quite a lot, but ultimately they will not be the experts in your PhD. You will be the expert. At the end of the process, you will be the expert in that topic, even more so than your supervisors. So I think it's about the best students kind of take ownership of that idea and they really drive themselves to become the experts. They will use their supervisors to build their expertise rather than expecting their supervisors to push them through the process. So that's my view of the ideal PhD student. Coming to funding opportunities for PhDs in the UK compared to the US, I'm not well versed enough in the US system to comment on that in detail. The PhD funding in the UK has changed in the last few years, so where most PhD funding is concentrated, at least the government funding for PhDs is concentrated in a few centers of excellence in different areas. So these so-called doctoral training centers that you'll come across. But as I said, most universities will fund, in every department, will fund a few PhD places every year. So there are always opportunities to find funded places for PhDs. And the best thing to do is to subscribe to updates from the websites like jobs.ac.uk or findaphd.com, and check regularly to see advertisements for funding. My knowledge of the US system is that because you are expected to enroll in the kind of master's taught part of the program, the funding is slightly different, and again, it will depend on what kind of grants that the supervisors have. But I think if you search on the websites like findaphd.com, you will find out where the funding opportunities are. Okay, so let me just switch. We're almost an hour into the conversation, so let me just switch back into my presentation. And I realized something I didn't do it. Okay, so yeah. So here's some things that would be useful to read as part of the process. So findaphd.com I just mentioned as a useful website with lots of resources and listings of programs. The book, The Unwritten Rules of PhD Research, it's actually written by a colleague of mine, Marion Petrie, and one of her collaborators, Gordon Rugg. It's a really useful read to give you some of the background of what's expected as part of a PhD. And reading it or something similar, you might find similar things online that are more freely available, can give you a lot of insight into what's expected and therefore how to write a good proposal and how to put a good application together. So that's something something to look at. And of course, it's always good to keep yourself amused and entertained. And phdcomics.com is a great resource for PhD-related humor. And this is an alternative take on the whole what is a PhD thing. So what you know versus how much you know about it. So of course, when you start your undergrad, you know a little bit about everything, and that how much you know keeps going up. So at masters, you know a bit more, but about less. In a PhD, you know a lot about next to nothing. And if you end up knowing a lot about nothing, you've gone too far. So try not to overshoot. So I'm happy to stay online for a little bit longer and answer further questions. Let me just scroll back and make sure I have answered some of the other questions, because I know that there was a question about changing subjects. Yes, that's right. So if you do sciences for bachelor's, can you do something, do you still have to do something related to that field in your master's? Not really true. You can find opportunities to do masters in different areas. And actually, it's not even true that your PhD has to be linked to your master's directly. So if you can use your master's to demonstrate that you know how to do research, you know the process of reading research literature, critiquing it, and identifying the strengths and weaknesses of what has come before. And at the same time, you can demonstrate that the problem you've identified in this other field that you're interested in doing a PhD in, whether that's sustainable energy or business, you read the literature in that area and demonstrate that you have an interesting problem. You have a interesting problem and a proposed way to try and attack that problem. So now the combination of these two things can get you a long way in a PhD application process. The only slightly tricky thing is if you're trying to pursue a PhD in a discipline that expects some basic skills that come from a bachelor's degree or a master's degree. So, for example, if you're trying to pursue a degree in chemistry, a PhD in chemistry, having never done chemistry at bachelor's or master's level, it'll be very difficult because they will expect you to have the lab skills of being in a wet chemistry lab and doing titrations or whatever the different experimental processes. And it's similar in computing. People will expect you to be a reasonably good programmer and designer of systems because that won't be taught and it's hard to learn while doing a PhD. So there is that caveat, but other than that, the idea of switching from a master's background in sociology or some related area into something that you have the basic skills for and you could develop the knowledge to deliver, that will be the way to do that. I think there was also a question about the level of academic attainment you need. So the GPA in undergrad and certainly beyond. As I said, hopefully I have kind of covered that in terms of when I talked about this potential for academic excellence aspect that PhD panels will be looking for. And I think it's about being able to articulate why you, despite a potentially low GPA, what have you done since that to address those gaps and examples of excellent achievement since then. It is a competitive process. So it's not about just meeting some minimum requirement and being guaranteed to get into a PhD program. So there's an element of luck as well then. So depending on who else applies at the same time for the same positions, you may be lucky enough that the low GPA doesn't become an issue. That's something to keep in mind. So we're just over the hour. I think I have answered everybody's questions. So last opportunity to ask some further questions. I think Okay, yeah, Tarindu's question is great. So, um, can we go directly from to a PhD from BSc, or do we have to go through the masters? So this depends on the universities. At the Open University, you can go directly from BSc to PhD, provided that you have at least an upper second for your BSc, or you can demonstrate sufficient research experience um, that kind of compensates for not having an upper second. It's more complicated, of course, if you don't have that basic academic requirement, but there are ways around it. So um, ideally, you'd have at least a 2-1, and other universities will have their own policies. So when you start looking at potential places to apply, read the regulations. There should be links to the admissions regulations, and you can find out those things. Um, Having a master's, well, there are a number of reasons to have a master's before you start. One is it just simply gives you time to develop a deeper understanding of a particular field and develop some of those basic research skills. Um, and so it's not, it's definitely worthwhile to go into a PhD with a master's. It reduces some of the early learning curve that you have to go through. But you can, I have multiple students who've started with a bachelor's degree, and one of whom successfully completed his PhD, and others who are just starting. So, okay. Well, great. Thank you very much, everyone, for spending the last hour listening to me talk. I will be sharing the slides, and I'll put a link up on the CEF website and share them through my blog. And yeah, if you are interested in investigating PhD options relating to my research area, you're very welcome to get in touch with me. But if you're thinking of going elsewhere, that's great. And best of luck with that. All right. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.